the BioHub, I have Lisa Deschamps. She is the CEO of AviadoBio. So after 25 years at Novartis, leading global launches in gene therapy, she's now at the helm of AviadoBio, developing treatments for FTD and other neuro conditions. Today we'll talk about career moves, mindset, culture, and what's ahead. So, pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Max. I really appreciate being here.
No, and we're actually in Aviado's office as well, which is a pleasure to be in. So thanks for inviting me.
Yes.
So let's just start with how your career began. So you started in sales, and then up to C-suite in Novartis. So what's the story behind your journey?
Well, the original story was that I didn't think I would end up in healthcare at all, so I didn't start out that way. I was a marketing major at university, and then actually wanted to go into fashion and spent a little time in fashion and ended up in healthcare by accident, I would say. But I'm so happy that I did because it's been a rewarding journey. I can't think of anything else that's more inspiring than being able to, have an exciting career and change people's lives. So very excited to be here. But I started carrying the bag, on the ground in sales, and as you say, worked my way up through Novartis through the years. And I couldn't believe I turned around. I had been there for 25 years. I'm like, how am I that old, number one? And where did the time go? But I'm very grateful for the tremendous amount of opportunity I had, being in such a large. At the time when I joined Novartis, it was Sandoz, so it was prior to the merger of Geigy, and then it became Novartis. And what that really afforded was just a tremendous, career opportunity to learn and grow, be exposed to trainings, and career development opportunities, be exposed to working in different, parts of the world, and all different types of roles, both sideways and linear. And so I feel very grateful for the time that I spent there and the opportunities that it afforded me.
Yeah. And then you've recently made the move into biotech.
I did.
What made you make that move?
Oh, it's a great question. For me, I always felt it was more of a when versus an if. I had really always been excited by the aspect of being in a more entrepreneurial environment. And in many cases, I had those experiences in Novartis. I always ran the business units that I was leading very lean and nimble and tried to really create that kind of collaborative environment where you didn't have people siloed in job functions. And I really like that kind of, some might think it's a little chaotic. I really love that integration, and I think you get the most productivity and have the most fun and greatest learnings in that. So my last couple of roles at Novartis, I was leading our U.S. and then our global neuroscience business. And my team had done an acquisition of a CNS gene therapy company called Avetix. And this was the main therapeutic that Avetix was developing is a product for SMA, spinal muscular atrophy, called Zolgensma, which I had the privilege with a wonderful team to be a part of launching all around the world. And so, my team led the acquisition. Then I went over to lead the worldwide commercialization of the acquired portfolio, which mainly in the short term was Zolgensma. And after spending a couple of years, I think about 3 years, bringing Zolgensma to, I think at that time, 41 markets around the world. And most importantly, I think when I left, we had treated over 2,000 children. It was hard to find something that was more rewarding and inspiring internally than that. And I just thought, cell and gene therapies overall, the more advanced therapies are, in my opinion, the future. And I wanted to be a part of taking the experience that I had gained over those last few years and bringing that to other organizations. There are very few people that had the privilege, and it was a privilege to be a part of something like that. It wasn't always easy. In fact, it was never easy, but it was so rewarding. And there's no roadmap, right? So everything we were doing was kind of a first time doing, right? So there was a lot of pain that came with that, and I wanted to be part of sharing those learnings and making a difference in other larger therapeutic areas. So, I guess, as they say, the rest is history, but, I used that as a jumping off point.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, you obviously had such a successful run in Big Pharma, then coming to biotech. What made you come to Aviado? in particular?
It's a great question. Because it's kind of like when you're buying a house, right? You're looking around and you're just not quite sure which one fits you perfect, but then one day you walk into it and it just clicks for you, and this is where I could see myself. And it was kind of like that. I had people, like yourself, reach out to me in the past, and I had never, been. It was never enough to jump, right, and push me over the edge. But I had the privilege to meet Professor Chris Shaw, who's one of the main scientific co-founders of Aviado, and the work that he was doing out of his lab at King's College London just really resonated with me, having just had the experience at Novartis on the CNS gene therapy side. I knew some of the key challenges that existed in bringing therapeutics like this, and really, one of the main challenges in CNS is crossing the blood-brain barrier and developing a gene therapy that can do that in a way that doesn't, cause toxicity is very difficult. And Chris was taking a complete innovative approach. Some may say he was a bit of a cowboy, right, in a sense, to direct delivery to the brain. But he was so compelling, and a lot of the work that he had shared with me during our initial conversations looked really promising. I just thought, wow, and also, to be honest, at the time the company was not in a good cash position.
Yeah.
So it was just seeded. It had less than 6 months of cash runway. Good investors, so 5 initial insiders, all top tier investors. But it was definitely a risk and a gamble. But I really believed in what I heard, and here I am.
Yeah. Does that come a big part of your decision-making process in terms of the cash already in the business when you were talking to these other startups?
Yeah.
Or?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, in the past I had, talked to companies that already were public or maybe were going for their B rounds.
Yeah.
So this was probably the earliest stage company that I had spoke to that had only seed and really was critical to get a Series A, like in the first 6 months of joining. So for me, I had kind of 3 kind of key areas that I was looking for. One is, always first and foremost, is it an area where there's a high unmet need that's compelling, that I can feel passionate about? Like if it doesn't check that box, I just personally can't do it. So that was one. The second piece was, who are the investors? And are they committed? Because, if they're not committed, drug development takes a long time, right? Or it can take a long time. And so you want to make sure that what you're setting out to do from a mission perspective can at least initially, and you'll always, macro environment changes, I get it, things happen with the science, but at least the intention of everybody at the table was there.
Yeah.
So that was my criteria number 2. And then the third piece of it was, from a cultural perspective, and again, it was a small team at the time. I think there was less than 10 people here, but at least with the founders and the initial management and the investors, did I click? Did I feel like culturally it was a good fit for me and would be a good opportunity? So that was kind of my kind of criteria when I joined, and it really did meet all of that. It was a big risk from the cash runway. I'm leaving a very safe role at Novartis, where I had spent, as you mentioned, over 25 years and had a lot of personal, equity, right?
Yeah.
From a reputation, experience perspective, to going into, jumping into something completely maybe unstable, right?
Yeah,
but it was exciting at the same time.
How was that? Like the move for you?
Yeah.
Was the first month like, oh, what have I done? Or was it pretty exciting?
Yeah, I thought it was really exciting. I don't know if it's for everybody, but I have never looked back from the day I left. I'm always, as mentioned, grateful for the time I spent on the big pharma side of the world. But from the moment I started, I haven't looked back, and I have found every experience, a great learning, exciting, very challenging at times, but I'm really enjoying it. I'm almost now 4 years in, and it's just been an incredible experience.
Yeah.
So I think it depends the experiences you've had prior, right? So for me, it was like, what can I leverage that I had spent my whole career prior learning, right? And I think coming from my last probably over 10 years at Novartis, I was leading therapeutically focused, independent kind of business units or franchises.
Yeah.
And so they were kind of end to end, right? So, from preclinical through commercialization, and they were very much singular therapeutically focused. So it was almost like a small independent therapeutically focused company, which is very transferable, right, to Aviado. Of course, the things that were completely new was raising capital, right, and working with the venture groups and building a network, and, and all of that. So that has been and still remains to be a tremendous learning. And of course, then the macro environment changed significantly over the last 4 years, right? So navigating that is everyday learning. But I think it's been, for me, I feel like the transition has been one of great learning, but all really positive. And I feel like a lot of the foundational principles that I gratefully have learned through my time at Novartis have really helped me navigate this new world.
Yeah, because you weren't necessarily in similar roles at Novartis. You moved around, great broad experience.
I did.
Yeah.
And I also had the privilege to work globally. I've lived in Switzerland 2 different times. I've managed teams all over the world at Novartis, so I knew all the different markets, whether it was from the clinical development side, the commercialization side, the reimbursement, regulatory, et cetera. So, when you work for a big pharma company like a Novartis, you have such exposure to so many different, paths, disciplines, functions in the company. So you have breadth and depth, which can really take you into lots of different opportunities from there. So.
Yeah, amazing. And then you mentioned mission as well. Just talk us through your mission, and then also just being in gene therapy, although amazing, it's in a tough space market-wise right now. Just how that relates as well.
Yeah, maybe I start with the last part first, because I think, we would call them advanced therapies. So cell and gene therapies overall, I don't know if I consider it a tough space. I think it's getting a little bit of a bad rap, right? But if you compare it to the biologic market, in the 70s, right? And you think about how long it took for biologics to be successfully developed, come into new therapeutic spaces like rheumatoid arthritis or MS or things like that, and become blockbusters. It took decades versus we're still in in a decade really since the first launches.
Yeah.
And we have already 5 blockbusters in the space, right? So I think at times of uncertainty in the macro environment, et cetera, we have had some failures, unfortunately, which is normal in science. I think people get a little bit anxious, but I think really for context and to ground ourselves, I continue to remain very calm on this because and try to level set everyone, because in comparison, it's actually been moving along very quickly.
Yeah.
What I do think is we need more commercial successes to get that investor confidence up. But from a patient perspective, having again, the privilege to launch a product like Zolgensma and see the impact that it can have on an individual child in that case, the family, the community at large. I can tell you nothing in my entire career has compared to that. I have launched over 14 other products in the market in various capacities at my roles in Novartis, and there was nothing that was quite like that, right? And to see, the difference you can truly make, not just symptomatically, but saving in this case, a child's life, and changing potentially their course of their entire life. It's it's a wow. And so I really still believe that cell and gene therapies are our future. They maybe hit a few bumps, but we really have to stay true, and we have to continually remind ourselves these things take time. From an Aviado perspective, our mission is to develop and translate, groundbreaking science and couple that with precision delivery, whether that's direct delivery or novel capsids, et cetera, and really turn those into life-changing medicines for people living with neurological conditions. And so that's our North Star. We're really focused on that every day, all day. We try to use that to make decisions strategically on, should we do this or that? What are the things, how should we look at our pipeline beyond our lead program? And really try, that I think is the hardest part, is having the discipline to really continuously assess what did you set out to do and make decisions that really align to that.
Yeah.
because you can go off in so many different directions.
Well, definitely, yeah. Well, let's talk about what you've achieved so far as well. Like, what's the journey you guys have been on from the start?
Yeah, so so from the start, our lead program is in FTD, frontal temporal dementia, which is unfortunately one of the most common forms of dementia in people under the age of 65. So very different than you think about Alzheimer's or things like this. This really affects people in the prime of their lives. We've met 20, 30-year-olds, 50-year-olds, and so people who are really, still working or just starting out, etc. And it does span older as well, but the crux of it is there, and it's very uncharacteristic to what you think about when you think about Alzheimer's, which is more cognitive impairment or memory loss, right? Initially, these people have either trouble communicating or have behavioral changes that are you think they're going through something psychological or they're having a midlife crisis or something. So it takes them so long to get diagnosed. So anyway, we've done a lot of work in FTD in general, just trying to educate and provide that context. But we moved our program. So from when I joined the company, we had just some in vivo data, some preclinical data, non-GLP, and we had to raise Series A off of that. At the end of 2021, we raised a Series A of 80 million. And that really enabled us to get the program now into the clinic. So last year, about a year ago exactly, we treated our very first patient. Now we're well on our way to completing our second cohort of patients. And so, it's really exciting. I mean, we have a complete novel direct delivery differentiated approach. We've treated the first ever intrathalamic delivery in adults. Scary, right? Extremely scary. But really exciting, and so far, knock on wood, because but so far so good, and so we're really excited about the opportunity and the difference that we can make in the space. There are no therapeutics today to treat these patients, these families. We're looking at a monogenic form, so it is a genetic condition, and so we're very actively engaged in the community. So that's kind of on our lead. So we've built the company from at that time 10 people to now 60. We've raised money, we've gotten our lead program into the clinic, and then we continue to evolve our pipeline and think about, okay, what's next, and how can we continue to bring therapeutics, to patients in need, and at the same time, enhance value for shareholders and build a sustainable, organization and culture.
Yeah. And what are you looking forward to in the future?
Yeah, so we have some really exciting milestones coming on our lead program, which is our Aspire trial. So as I think I mentioned, we are coming to the completion of our second cohort, and so we'll be sharing some of that data, publicly really soon. But also, one thing I forgot to mention before when you asked about some of the things we've achieved, we have a really exciting partnership with Astellas. So in October of last year, we announced an opportunity to collaborate with Astellas, and they have a worldwide exclusive option on our lead program in FTD. And so with that comes along the opportunity to work with them really collaboratively in the space during this option period. We were able to bring in some financial capital, so they put in about $50 million in cash, in a combination of dilutive and non-dilutive, so they've also become investors in Aviado. And we just really see that as a really exciting partnership potentially for the future should they exercise the option. So they're very invested in genetic medicines. We feel it's a good fit culturally. We're very much aligned on the opportunity and the differences we can make together. And so, I think, continuing to advance the lead program, sharing that, those outcomes, from a milestone standpoint, even with the rest of the world, as well as, really continuing to work with Astellas and collaborate with them, not only in FTD, but potentially more broadly as we go.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah.
It's seriously exciting. I'm glad you just mentioned culture, because that's my next question.
Okay, all right, good.
We spoke mindset, culture, actually, just before we jumped on this. They're clearly important to you in trying to build this company sustainably. I'm just going to ask you broadly, like, how you distill that culture and your mindset across this growing business.
Yeah, it is a great question. And I always think of culture as an outcome. To me, culture is kind of how people feel, how they feel about being part of something, how they behave and act in that environment. Now, sometimes you have to think of culture as purposefully, right? Like, how do you build the culture you want, right? And especially in a new organization, or sometimes when you need a correction of an organization, you kind of think of culture, think of it top down. But I always try to think about it bottoms up, right? How do we hire the right talent? Starts with the right people, with the right mindset, who are truly coming together, believe in the mission that we're setting out to do, come together with a real will and sense of urgency and passion around that mission, and really want to work together and collaborate. So, I think about it as, hiring the right talent, setting the right vision, and making sure that we constantly remind ourselves of why we're here. Because I think you can, in the everyday hustle and bustle, chaos of the world we live in, you can lose track of that.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's always about anchoring us around the patient. And the families and the communities that we can make a difference on. And I feel like that's where everybody can align, whether you're, working in facility management or manufacturing or in the lab or business development, everyone should be anchored and aligned on that common goal. And so I really look for that mindset in people, because then it's less about, well, I do this and you do this, right? I hate that.
Yeah.
For me, if you're at the table, you are part of the conversation, whether it's your swim lane or not. When you leave, you have to go out and you have to execute your swim lane, and that's why we have functional expertise, right? But when you come to the table, if you're invited to be at the table, then you should be contributing, you should be part of that conversation, you should be asking questions. And I really feel a big part of the culture is making sure that people work collaboratively, making sure everybody, again, is anchored on that mission and those foundational principles, and making sure that people are just inquisitive and curious, provocative, and thinking about, well, what would need to be true to actually do this, right? Because there's a lot of that can't be done, right? And that drives me crazy. And I really strive to build a culture where people ask themselves that question. I learned this from one of my previous leaders. It's just a question I always ask myself, and I try to instill that in the culture here. We're not there yet. Not everybody loves that question, to be honest, but I think it's a critical question. And if you think about it that way, then it takes the emotion or the defense out of saying, well, no, that can't be done. That wasn't the question. The question was what would need to be true to enable that to be done? Because then you build a little psychological safety into that, right? So I think hiring the right people, making sure they're anchored around a clear vision and mission, and building that kind of psychological safety and curiosity to achieve things that, quite frankly, are really difficult and that most people don't think are possible, right?
Yeah.
And so, I think if you have that together, you can really build a thriving culture.
Yeah, because your goals are so big as a company. Like, what you're setting out to achieve is it's world changing. Yeah. So then breaking that down to the not looking so far into the distance of, wow, that's so far away, to breaking it down into those little wins and patience in the shorter term is surely pretty important.
Yeah, agree. 100%.
Yeah. We briefly mentioned it before. The current market is making it, it's been turbulent, right? So it's making early startup biotechs that little bit harder than what it was probably 4 years ago. Mm-hmm. How are you changing your strategy to maybe coincide that?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's an everyday activity, to be honest. Not changing the strategy, but just navigating the macro environment. So, I think I would say this, whether we were in a tough macro environment or we were not in a tough macro environment, I think we always have to be really prudent on spend. I operated like that at Novartis, and obviously you have to operate that even with an extra layer in a company like, Aviado or any biotech startup. I think just being really prudent, making sure you're finding the right balance of cash preservation at the same time progression, right? Because if you don't progress the programs and you're only saving money, then you're not not doing anything accretive, right? Or adding value to your shareholders, and ultimately not getting anything to patients, right? So that goes against our entire mission, right? But that doesn't mean that we're not very prudent on cash management and making sure that we're only spending things that will make a difference and drive progression. So I'll always ask as well, if we didn't do this, what would happen? And if we did do this, what would happen? And depending on the answer, we either do it or we don't do it, right? What's the must-have versus the nice-to-have? And is doing this going to really impact, a better program, a better clinical decision, a better impact for a patient, a better value for a shareholder, et cetera. So just being really disciplined and prudent about that. We've had to pivot our pipeline strategy. There was data that came out in the macro environment that gave us a lot of question about some of the targets we were looking at. At the same time, we had some of our own internal data that raised some questions. So even though we were passionate about some of those programs, we paused them because we couldn't look ourselves in the mirror and say it makes sense to keep going until we know more. And so we've made some of those tough decisions, and those are tough not only to do, but on the people who have a lot of heart and passion for them, as well as the patients who are waiting, right? So, and then you have to pivot and say, okay, what else should we be doing that's aligned to our mission and based on our expertise and capabilities? So it's an everyday, I would say, being agile and being open-minded and and just continuously being well disciplined is an everyday management opportunity.
I think it's been interesting. I think you think about it every day makes so much sense, because I remember it like the start of 24, I was talking to CEOs and their mindset was just survive till 25. I heard that so often, survive till 25, but then this has gone on longer than what people anticipated. So it's no longer that statement, it's now like, well, what are we looking at, 26 now?
Right.
So having to constantly adapt.
Yeah, and I think the principles are relevant regardless whether we're in a tough macro environment or not. I think we should use them as learnings, right? Because you should always ask yourself those questions.
Yeah.
At times you have to make more sacrifice than you would like to when times are less tough. But just having the discipline are great learnings for all of us, as we come out of this, right? The pandemic taught us how to do a lot more remotely, and we navigated that. And what are the learnings the tough macro environment, the economic environment has taught us that we take with us as we go forward as well. And so I think these are always, new tools that we put in our as our part of the way we think about our businesses and run them.
Yeah,
So.
I think it's really interesting. Just moving on to the final question, which is one we ask all our guests.
Okay.
So if you could meet with any scientist or innovator for dinner, past or present,
Okay.
who would it be and why?
Well, it's an easy one for me. Professor Chris Shaw, who is one of the main scientific co-founders of Aviado, is somebody that I have had dinner with and would love to continue to have dinner with. He's just a brilliant man, so neurologist, neuroscientist by training, but really for me with Chris, his passion is, and his kind of goal to bring a therapeutic to patients, or as he says, generations of patients that he's met through his career, has just really been his North Star. And when I first met him, it's the reason I came to Aviado. He just spoke to me like he pulled at my heartstrings, and I really believed what he could do because of the passion. Less so because of his brilliance, of course it's there, and his technical abilities, absolutely. But when you see such a will to make a difference, you believe that person will have the power to do it. And so, in addition to that, he's just an extremely interesting person. He loves music. He's from New Zealand originally, and just, fun and social to be around. But, for me, just seeing that kind of passion combined with that kind of brilliance is just somebody that, I'm thrilled to have met him. I feel it's been an honor, and enjoy very much spending time with him.
It's such a good answer. Yeah. Look, thank you so much for coming on, inviting me down here.
Thank you for coming. I'm so glad you were here, and we appreciate being able to share some of our story.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Look, everyone please like and subscribe to the BioHub, and thank you again.
Thank you.